By late March 1945, the Third Reich was no longer a state. It was a crumbling edifice of shattered dreams and burning cities. To the Allied High Command, the war in Europe had entered its mop-up phase. The Rhine had been crossed, the Ruhr pocket was being squeezed tight, and General George S. Patton's Third Army was racing across central Germany with a velocity that defied traditional logistics. The prevailing sentiment among the American GIs of the 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds, was one of cautious optimism. They believed the era of last-stand battles was over. They expected the white bedsheets of surrender to greet them in every village. However, as the division's lead elements turned their maps toward Aschaffenburg, a historic medieval city nestled on the banks of the Main River, the atmosphere shifted. Aschaffenburg was not merely another road hub. It was a Festung, fortress, designated by a final, desperate decree from the Führer bunker in Berlin. The city was to be held at all costs, not for strategic necessity, but as a symbolic altar for National Socialist defiance. The tragedy of Aschaffenburg cannot be understood without the psychological profile of its commander, Major Emil Lambert. Unlike many Wehrmacht officers who, by 1945, sought to preserve their men and their heritage through honorable surrender, Lambert was a biological manifestation of Nazi fanaticism. He was a man who viewed the world through the binary lens of absolute obedience or absolute treason. Lambert did not see a city of 30,000 civilians. He saw a static fortification. He did not see the historic Schloss Johannesburg as a 300-year-old architectural treasure, but as a pile of red sandstone that could house machine gun nests. His command was comprised of a motley collection of remnants, convalescent soldiers pulled from hospital beds, elderly Volkssturm men with antiquated rifles, and most tragically boys from the Hitler Youth, some as young as 14, who had been fed a diet of martyrdom. To ensure this fragile force did not break, Lambert instituted a reign of terror within the city walls that mirrored the very worst of the SS. On the 28th of March 1945, as the scouts of the 45th Division approached the outskirts of the city, they witnessed a sight that would permanently alter their moral compass for the remainder of the war. Lining the entry roads and the central squares were the bodies of German civilians swaying from lampposts and trees. These were not casualties of Allied shelling. They were victims of Lambert's flying courts-martial. Signs were draped around their necks with the chilling inscription, "Here hanged Moat traitor. Here hangs a traitor." Their crime was defeatism, the act of attempting to save their families by sewing white flags or whispering of surrender. Lambert had turned the city's infrastructure of light into an infrastructure of death. The American soldiers, who had entered Germany as liberators of a suppressed people, were suddenly confronted with a population so terrified of their own leadership that they were forced to choose between death by an American shell or death by a German noose. This sight extinguished any lingering sense of chivalry in the hearts of the Thunderbirds. As the American infantry moved into the suburbs, the easy surrender they had envisioned evaporated into a lethal urban nightmare. Lambert had not only threatened the civilians, he had weaponized them. American GIs reported seeing women dropping grenades from second-story windows and old men in civilian suits firing Panzerfausts from cellar vents. This was the ultimate war crime of the Nazi leadership, the erasure of the line between combatant and non-combatant. The American soldiers faced a harrowing tactical dilemma. Every closed shutter was a potential sniper nest. Every crying child could be a lure into an ambush. For the young men from Oklahoma and Arizona who made up the 45th, the hesitation to fire on civilians was costing them lives. Casualties began to mount in the narrow, winding streets of the old town. The Thunderbirds realized they weren't fighting an army. They were fighting a city that had been transformed into a suicide cult. The shift in American doctrine, from liberation to erasure, the command post of the 45th Division outside Aschaffenburg became the site of a grim strategic pivot. The American commanders, including Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, were receiving reports of the hangings and the fanatical resistance. The anger among the ranks was palpable. The logic of the night's war was discarded. The decision was made. The lives of American sons would no longer be traded for the preservation of German timber and stone. If Major Lambert wanted to turn the city into a fortress, the Americans would treat it as one. They would not storm Aschaffenburg house by house. They would dismantle it piece by piece. The order went out to pull back the infantry and bring forward the long toms and the self-propelled M12s. This was the moment Aschaffenburg's fate was sealed. The Americans were about to unleash a technological apocalypse on the medieval town. marking the day they stopped playing by the rules and began the systematic application of overwhelming, concentrated fire. The message to Lambert was silent but deafening. If you choose to die for your Führer, we will provide the means. By the morning of the 29th of March 1945, the strategic patience of the U.S. 45th Infantry Division had reached its breaking point. The Thunderbirds had learned a bitter lesson in the suburbs. In a city commanded by a fanatic, mercy was a tactical liability. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks and his superiors realized that as long as the medieval structures of Aschaffenburg stood, they provided cover for Major Lambert's snipers and execution squads. The American command issued a directive that would define the final weeks of the war in Germany. Maximum firepower, minimum exposure. The infantry was ordered to withdraw from the narrow kill zones of the inner city. In their place, the Americans moved their heavy assets to the high ground overlooking the main river. This was no longer a battle for a city. It was an industrial demolition. The bombardment that followed was not the precision strike of modern warfare, but a saturation of steel and high explosives. The Americans deployed the 155mm long Tom field guns and the M12 gun motor carriages. Usually, artillery is fired in an indirect arc, hidden behind hills. But at Aschaffenburg, the Americans engaged in direct fire. They lowered the massive barrels and pointed them straight at the timber-framed houses and stone steeples. The effect was cataclysmic. A 155mm shell weighs nearly 100 pounds. When it hits a medieval building at point-blank range, the structure does not just collapse, it disintegrates into a cloud of red dust and splinters. Block by block, the historic heart of the city was erased. The American GIs sat on the surrounding hills, smoking rations and watching the horizon glow orange. An American sergeant later noted with grim detachment, "After seeing those civilians hanging from the lamps, nobody felt like saving a single brick of that town." At the center of the storm stood the Schloss Johannesburg, a magnificent red sandstone palace built in the early 1600s. With walls nearly 8 feet thick and towering spires, it was one of the most significant Renaissance castles in Germany. To Major Lambert, it was his Alamo. He moved his most fanatical SS remnants and Hitler Youth units into the castle's subterranean bunkers, believing the thick stone would protect them forever. The Americans did not attempt to storm the gates. Instead, they brought up an M12 self-propelled gun, a massive 155mm cannon mounted on a tank chassis, and parked it directly in front of the castle's main entrance. The German defenders, looking through narrow arrow slits, saw the yawning black mouth of the cannon just hundreds of yards away. The first shells struck the castle's great tower. The red sandstone, which had survived centuries of European wars, shattered like glass. The Americans fired with rhythmic, terrifying persistence. They targeted the base of the towers, the roofline, and the reinforced gates. Inside the castle, the situation was a descent into a literal hell. The beautiful courtyards were filled with the screams of wounded boys and the dust of pulverized history. The red dust from the sandstone coated everything, making the defenders look like blood-stained ghosts. Despite the chaos, Lambert roamed the corridors with a drawn pistol, threatening to execute anyone who spoke of surrender. He was a man who preferred a kingdom of ashes over a life of defeat. By the first days of April, Aschaffenburg had ceased to function as a city. It was a landscape of craters, burning timber, and the stench of death. The fortress that Hitler had demanded was now a tomb. The civilians who remained in cellars were starving and terrified, caught between the American shells falling from the sky and Lambert's executioners lurking in the shadows. However, the hammer and anvil tactics of the U.S. Army were achieving their psychological goal. Even the most brainwashed Hitler Youth began to realize that no miracle weapon was coming to save them. The wall of fire was moving closer every hour. The American Thunderbirds had sent a clear message. They would not stop until the last stone was overturned. The era of the nightly stand was over. The era of the 155mm shell had arrived. On the morning of the 3rd of April 1945, a strange and heavy silence descended upon the ruins of Aschaffenburg. The thunder of the American 155mm guns, which had been the city's constant heartbeat for 10 days, suddenly ceased. The red sandstone of Schloss Johannesburg, now a jagged skeleton of its former Renaissance glory, stood shrouded in a thick pall of dust and smoke. Inside the castle, the fanatical spell was finally breaking. The teenage soldiers of the Hitler Youth and the battered veterans of the Wehrmacht were no longer looking at Major Lambert as a leader. but as a madman driving them into a mass grave. Even the most hardened among them could not ignore the reality. They were fighting a wall of fire with bolt-action rifles. As the American infantry prepared for a final, overwhelming assault to clear the remaining nests of resistance, a white flag improvised from a bedsheet emerged from a jagged hole in the castle's southern wall. The surrender was not a moment of dignity, but one of profound bitterness. As the German soldiers emerged, they looked like apparitions caked in the red dust of their pulverized city, their eyes hollow from shell shock. Finally, Major Emil Lambert walked out. In a display of staggering narcissism, he was impeccably dressed in his dress uniform, his medals polished, his head held high as if he were a conqueror rather than the architect of his city's annihilation. He approached Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks. Lambert, still clinging to the delusions of Prussian military etiquette, snapped a crisp salute and began a rehearsed speech about the honor of the German soldier and the heroic defense of the city. Sparks, a man who had seen the bodies of his men torn apart in the streets and the corpses of civilians hanging from lamp posts, did not return the salute. He looked at the ruins, then back at Lambert, and famously ordered his MPs, "Get him out of my sight before I shoot him myself." As Lambert was led away in a jeep, the true cost of his fanaticism was revealed. The surviving citizens of Aschaffenburg crawled out of their damp, dark cellars. They did not look at Lambert with respect. They looked at him with a murderous hatred. These were the people whose fathers and sons he had hanged, whose homes he had turned into rubble. Cries of "murderer" and "butcher" followed the jeep. The people spat at the man who had claimed to be their protector. For the citizens of Aschaffenburg, the Americans were not the ones who had destroyed their city. Lambert was. He had held the city hostage for an ideology that was already dead, and in doing so, he had ensured that 90% of their world was reduced to dust. When General George S. Patton visited the ruins, he surveyed the destruction with a grim, professional satisfaction. He did not celebrate the loss of life, but he celebrated the efficiency of the method. Patton understood that the destruction of Aschaffenburg served a higher strategic purpose. He used the city as a terrifying warning to every other German town in the path of the Third Army. Messages were sent ahead to subsequent mayors and commanders. "Remember Aschaffenburg. Surrender now, or we will bring the heavy guns." The tactic worked. Across Bavaria, dozens of towns that might have resisted chose to hang out white sheets the moment American tanks appeared on the horizon. By destroying one city that refused to quit, Patton arguably saved dozens of others and thousands of American and German lives that would have been lost in useless street fighting. Major Emil Lambert's story did not end with the war. He was put on trial, but significantly, his primary charges were not for his actions against American troops, which were considered acts of war, but for the murder of his own countrymen. He was found guilty of the summary executions of German civilians who had tried to surrender. Though originally sentenced to death, his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment during the complexities of the post-war legal era. He lived out his days in disgrace, a man reviled by the very people he claimed to lead. The destruction of Aschaffenburg remains one of the most controversial chapters of the war. It asks the haunting question: is it a war crime to level a city, or is it a moral necessity to save the lives of your own soldiers? The answer remains buried in the red dust of the main river valley. The Thunderbirds had entered as liberators, but Lambert's madness forced them to become destroyers, proving that in the face of absolute fanaticism, mercy is the first casualty of war.